Welcome back to Aqua Reads, where we dive deep into the world of captivating short stories. I'm here to take you on another literary journey that'll leave you thinking long after the last word. So get comfortable, maybe grab a cup of tea, and let's begin.
Darkwater's the first thing you learn working on freight ships is that the ocean doesn't care about your problems. The second thing you learn is that neither do most of the people running the ship. My name is Eric Adler, and I've been an electrician on cargo vessels for 8 years. What happened aboard the Northern Horizon 3 months ago still wakes me up at night. But I need to tell this story. Someone needs to know the truth. The Northern Horizon was a beast. A 900-foot container ship hauling everything from electronics to grain across the Pacific. I'd been aboard for 6 weeks when the trouble started. Part of a crew of 32 souls making the run from Long Beach to Manila. The ship was old, maybe 20 years past her prime. But the Meridian Shipping Company squeezed every dollar they could from her rusty bones. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped into the engine room that Tuesday morning. The air tasted different, metallic, with an undertone that made my teeth ache. As the ship's senior electrician, I was responsible for maintaining the electrical systems that kept us alive out there. Navigation, communications, pumps, lighting, refrigeration for the crew quarters and cargo holds. Everything ran on electricity, and electricity was my domain. The smell led me to distribution panel C-7, located in the lower engine room near the generator sets. What I found there made my blood run cold. The insulation around the main feeder cables was deteriorating, exposing bare copper conductors that carried 4,160 volts. Worse, I could see signs of arcing. Those telltale black scorch marks that meant electricity had been jumping where it shouldn't. In the humid, salt-laden air of a ship's engine room, exposed high-voltage conductors were a recipe for catastrophe. But it wasn't just the damaged insulation that worried me. The cables were routed directly above the ship's fuel oil day tank, a 500-gallon reservoir that fed the massive diesel engines. Any significant electrical fault could ignite those fuel vapors. And in an engine room filled with combustible materials, that would mean disaster. I spent the rest of that morning documenting everything with my camera and multimeter. The insulation resistance readings were dangerously low, well below the minimum standards set by the International Electrotechnical Commission. The cables needed to be replaced immediately. But that meant shutting down the main generators for at least 8 hours while we ran temporary power lines and swapped out nearly 100 feet of high-voltage cable. Chief Engineer Rodriguez wasn't happy when I knocked on his office door that afternoon. A thick-set man with graying temples and 30 years at sea. Rodriguez ran the engine department with an iron fist and an eye always on the schedule. "What is it, Adler?" he asked without looking up from his maintenance logs. "We've got a serious electrical problem in the lower engine room," I said, setting my photos and test results on his desk. "The main feeder cables to panel C7 are failing. The insulation is shot, and I'm seeing signs of arcing. We need to replace these cables before something catastrophic happens." Rodriguez finally looked up, glancing briefly at my documentation. "How long to fix it?" 8 hours minimum, sir. We'd need to shut down the main generators and run on emergency power while we install new cables. His face darkened. "Absolutely not. We're already behind schedule thanks to that storm last week. Captain Morrison is breathing down my neck to make up time. These old ships always have electrical quirks. Just keep an eye on it and fix it when we reach Manila." "Sir, with respect, this isn't a quirk. These cables are carrying over 4,000 volts. And they're deteriorating rapidly. If they fail completely, we could have an explosion." "Adler, I've been running engine rooms since before you were born. I know what a real emergency looks like. And this isn't one. Monitor it closely. But we're not shutting down the plant. That's final. I left his office frustrated but not defeated. In 8 years at sea, I'd learned that sometimes you have to go around the chain of command to protect lives. That evening, I requested a meeting with Captain Morrison himself. Captain Sarah Morrison was a rarity in the merchant marine. A woman who'd clawed her way up to command through skill and determination. At 45, she had silver threads in her auburn hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades fighting the ocean. Her cabin was Spartanly decorated, with charts covering one wall and a single photo of what looked like her daughter on the desk. "Electrician Adler," she said as I entered. "Chief Rodriguez mentioned you have some concerns about the electrical system." "Yes, ma'am." I placed my documentation in front of her, more detailed than what I'd shown Rodriguez. "The main power cables in the lower engine room are failing. The insulation is breaking down. And I'm seeing electrical arcing. If these cables fail completely, we could have a fire or explosion." Captain Morrison studied my photos carefully, her expression growing more serious as she flipped through them. "What do you recommend?" "We need to shut down the main generators and replace these cables immediately. I can have temporary power lines rigged to maintain essential systems. But we'd need to reduce speed significantly." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the porthole at the darkening Pacific. "How much time would this delay add to our schedule?" 12 to 16 hours. "Ma'am, but if these cables fail catastrophically, we could lose the ship." "Adler, I appreciate your diligence, but Chief Rodriguez has 40 years of experience. If he says we can monitor the situation until Manila, I trust his judgment. Continue your inspections and report any changes immediately." I felt the familiar knot of frustration in my stomach as I left her cabin. In the maritime world, hierarchy was everything, and I'd just hit a wall. But I couldn't let it go. Lives were at stake, including my own. Among those lives was Elena Vasquez, the ship's communications officer. Elena had joined the crew 2 months ago, replacing an officer who'd retired in Long Beach. She was 28, with dark eyes that lit up when she laughed and a quick wit that could diffuse tension in any room. We'd grown close during the long Pacific crossing, sharing meals and conversations that stretched late into the night watches. I found her that evening in the communications room, updating weather reports and checking satellite email traffic. The gentle hum of electronics filled the small space, and the blue glow of multiple monitors cast shadows across her face. "You look troubled," she said without turning around. "Let me guess. Chief Rodriguez shot down another one of your maintenance requests." "It's more serious than that." I told her about the deteriorating cables, about my failed attempts to convince the senior officers. "Elena, if those cables fail, people are going to die." She turned in her chair, studying my face. "You really think it's that bad?" "I know it is. I've seen what happens when high-voltage systems fail catastrophically. The arcing alone could ignite fuel vapors, and we'd have an explosion that would tear through the engine room." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd told her. "What can you do?" "Keep monitoring it, I guess. Hope we make it to Manila before everything goes to hell." I paused, suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. "Elena, if something does happen, nothing's going to happen," she said firmly. But I caught the concern in her eyes. "You're good at your job, Eric. If anyone can keep us safe, it's you." Over the next 3 days, I checked those cables every 4 hours, documenting the steady degradation of the insulation. The arcing was getting worse. I could see fresh scorch marks appearing daily. The insulation resistance readings continued to drop. I sent daily reports to both Chief Rodriguez and Captain Morrison, but received only terse acknowledgments in return. On Friday morning, Exactly 1 week after I'd first discovered the problem, my worst fears began to materialize. I was conducting my routine inspection when I heard it. A sharp crackling sound coming from behind panel C-7. I grabbed my flashlight and peered into the cable space. What I saw made my heart race. One of the main feeder conductors had developed a visible corona discharge. A purple-blue glow that meant the electrical field around the conductor was ionizing the surrounding air. The insulation was now so deteriorated that electricity was literally leaking into the atmosphere. It was only a matter of time before we had a complete breakdown. I ran to the nearest phone and called the bridge. Captain Morrison. This is Adler in the engine room. We have an immediate electrical emergency. I need to shut down the main generators now. Adler. We've been through this, came Rodriguez's voice. He'd obviously grabbed the phone from the captain. You're overreacting to normal wear and tear. Continue monitoring and... His words were cut off by a sound I'll never forget. A deep, resonant crack followed by the roar of arcing electricity. The lights in the engine room flickered, and I could smell ozone mixing with something else. Something that made my nose burn. I dropped the phone and ran toward panel C-7. Through the observation window, I could see electrical fire dancing between the conductors. Brilliant white arcs jumping across gaps that shouldn't exist. The temperature in the cable space was rising rapidly, and I could see smoke beginning to seep from the panel. But it was what I saw below the panel that turned my blood to ice. Fuel oil was dripping from a loose connection on the day tank, forming a small puddle directly beneath the arcing conductors. The vapors were already rising, and I knew that in seconds, maybe less, those electrical arcs would find the fuel. I had perhaps 10 seconds to act. Training kicked in. I lunged for the emergency generator shutdown switch. A large red button protected by a safety cover. The cover flew off, and I slammed my palm down on the button. The massive diesel generators began winding down, but electricity was still flowing from the ship's emergency batteries. 8 seconds. I sprinted to the battery disconnect panel, my fingers flying over switches I could operate blindfolded after 8 years. The main battery contactors opened with audible clicks, cutting power to the distribution system. 5 seconds. But even with the generators shut down, the electrical arcs continued, fed by residual energy in the system's massive capacitors. The purple-blue corona discharge grew brighter, reaching toward the rising fuel vapors like deadly fingers. 3 seconds. I grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher, a CO2 unit designed for electrical fires, and aimed it at the arcing conductors. The carbon dioxide cloud enveloped the panel, temporarily suppressing the discharge. 1 second. The fuel vapors found the arc. The explosion threw me backward across the engine room, my ears ringing as a ball of orange flame erupted from panel C-7. The blast wave shattered gauges and knocked tools from their brackets. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main lighting system died, casting everything in an eerie red glow. But this was just the beginning. The initial explosion had ruptured fuel lines throughout the lower engine room. Diesel oil sprayed from broken connections, and within seconds, the entire compartment was ablaze. The automatic fire suppression system activated, flooding the space with CO2. But the damage was already spreading. I picked myself up from the deck, my head spinning and my left arm throbbing where I'd hit a bulkhead. Through the smoke and flames, I could see that the explosion had damaged structural supports. The deck plating above was sagging, and I could hear the ominous groaning of stressed metal. The ship's general alarm began wailing. 7 short blasts followed by 1 long blast, repeated continuously. Every person aboard knew what that meant. Abandon ship. But I couldn't abandon ship. Not yet. Alina's voice crackled over the emergency communication system. All hands. This is the bridge. We have a major fire in the engine room. All non-essential personnel muster at lifeboat stations immediately. Engine room personnel implement emergency procedures. I keyed my portable radio. Elena, this is Eric. The main engines are down. And we have major structural damage. How long before you lose communications? Battery backup gives me maybe 30 minutes. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the strain. Eric, you need to get out of there. Not yet. There are people trapped. Through the smoke, I could hear voices calling for help from the upper engine room. The explosion had warped the access ladder, and at least 2 crew members were trapped above the fire. I recognized one voice. Tommy Rodriguez, the chief engineer's nephew and a kid I'd been training in electrical systems. The CO2 suppression system was keeping the fire from spreading upward, but it was also making it hard to breathe. I grabbed an emergency breathing apparatus from the nearest locker and made my way toward the voices. Tommy Rodriguez and Jake Morrison, the captain's son, working his first voyage as a wiper, were trapped behind a wall of twisted metal where the explosion had collapsed part of the upper catwalk. Both were conscious but shaken. Eric, Tommy called out when he saw me. The ladder's blocked. We can't get down. I assessed the situation quickly. The main access ladder was indeed impassable, crushed by debris from the explosion. But there was another way. An emergency escape route through the ventilation shafts that led to the deck above. Follow me, I shouted over the noise of the fire and alarms. We're going up through the vent system. The ventilation shaft was a tight fit, barely wide enough for a person. But it was our only option. I led the way, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as we crawled through the metal ducting. Behind me, I could hear Tommy and Jake breathing heavily, fighting claustrophobia and fear. We emerged on the main deck just as Captain Morrison was ordering the lifeboats prepared for launch. The Northern Horizon was already developing a list to starboard as seawater flooded compartments damaged by the explosion. Eric, Elena ran toward me, relief evident in her voice. Thank God you're okay. We need to get everyone off this ship, I said, still catching my breath. The structural damage is worse than it looks. She's not going to stay afloat much longer. Captain Morrison approached, her face grim. How bad is it, Adler? The explosion compromised the hull integrity near the engine room. We're taking on water faster than the pumps can handle. And, without main power, we can't run the emergency pumps effectively. She nodded curtly. All hands abandon ship. Electrician Adler, can you maintain communications long enough to send a mayday? I'll try. Ma'am. Elena and I ran back to the communications room, where she was already transmitting our position and emergency status. The ship's list was getting worse, and I could see water beginning to slosh through the lower corridors. Mayday! 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 This is motor vessel Northern Horizon. Position 35 degrees 12 minutes north, 140 degrees 30 minutes west. We have suffered a major explosion and are abandoning ship. 32 souls on board. Launching lifeboats now. I worked frantically to keep power flowing to the radio equipment, rerouting circuits around damaged systems and nursing every amp from the failing batteries. Elena's voice remained calm and professional as she coordinated with the Coast Guard station in Honolulu. Northern Horizon. This is Coast Guard Honolulu. We have your position and are dispatching rescue assets. Estimated time to arrival is 6 hours. Can you maintain position? Elena looked at me questioningly. I shook my head. The ship was settling by the stern, and we had maybe an hour before she went down. Coast Guard Honolulu. Negative on maintaining position. Ship is sinking rapidly. We are abandoning to lifeboats now. The deck was tilting at a dangerous angle as we made our way to the lifeboat stations. Most of the crew was already in the boats, but I could see that one of the lifeboats, number 3, was having problems with its davit system. The boat was stuck halfway down the side of the ship, with 6 crew members trapped inside. The davit motor is dead, Chief Rodriguez called out as I approached. His face was streaked with soot, and I could see the devastation in his eyes as he watched his ship dying. I looked up at the lifeboat, suspended 20 feet above the churning water. The crew inside included Elena. She'd been helping coordinate the evacuation and had ended up in the last boat. The manual release system had jammed, and without power to the davit motor, they were trapped. I can fix it, I said, grabbing my tool bag and starting up the tilted deck toward the davit controls. Adler, there's no time, Captain Morrison shouted. The ship's going down. Then I better work fast. The davit control panel was partially submerged as seawater sloshed across the sloping deck. I waded through knee-deep water. My tools clutched against my chest. The electrical connections were corroded by salt water. But I could see the problem. A blown fuse in the motor control circuit. I didn't have a replacement fuse, but I had something better. A short piece of copper wire from my tool bag. It was dangerous and against every safety protocol I'd ever learned, but it would complete the circuit long enough to get the lifeboat down. The jury-rigged connection sparked as I made the final connection, but the davit motor roared to life. Slowly, the lifeboat began descending toward the water. Eric, get to a lifeboat, Elena called out as her boat touched the water and released from the davits. I looked around and realized that in focusing on the mechanical systems, I'd missed something crucial. I was alone on the deck. The northern horizon was going down fast now, her stern disappearing beneath the waves as her bow rose into the air like a steel mountain. There was only one option left. I ran to the starboard rail and dove into the Pacific. The water was shockingly cold, maybe 60 degrees. And the waves were 8 feet high with whitecaps. I surfaced, gasping and disoriented, just in time to see the northern horizon's bow slide beneath the waves with a sound like thunder. Over here, Elena's voice carried across the water. Lifeboat number 3 was maybe 100 yards away, but fighting the waves in my heavy work clothes, it might as well have been 100 miles. I'm not a strong swimmer under the best circumstances. And these were far from the best circumstances. The cold water was sapping my strength, and my waterlogged boots felt like anchors dragging me down. But I forced myself to keep moving, one stroke at a time, toward the orange shape of the lifeboat. Elena had convinced the others to row toward me, fighting against the current and wind. Hands reached down and hauled me over the gunwale, where I collapsed in the bottom of the boat, coughing up seawater and shivering uncontrollably. You crazy bastard, Elena said, but she was smiling as she wrapped an emergency blanket around my shoulders. You could have been killed. Couldn't leave you hanging there, I managed between chattering teeth. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life. 3 lifeboats carrying 32 survivors floated in the middle of the Pacific, connected by lines to stay together. We shared water and emergency rations, told stories to keep morale up, and watched the horizon for any sign of rescue. Chief Rodriguez was in our boat, and during those long hours, he finally told me what I needed to hear. Adler, you were right about those cables. I should have listened. His voice was barely above a whisper. I was so focused on staying on schedule, I forgot that our first responsibility is to the crew. We all made mistakes, I said, but everyone survived. That's what matters. Just before sunset, we saw the distinctive silhouette of a Coast Guard cutter on the horizon. The USCGC Steadfast reached us as darkness fell, her searchlights sweeping across the water until they found our small flotilla of orange lifeboats. The rescue was textbook perfect. One by one, we were winched aboard the cutter, where Navy corpsmen treated us for hypothermia and shock. Elena and I found ourselves sitting together in the ship's mess, sharing hot coffee and trying to process what had happened. So what happens now? She asked. There'll be an investigation. The Coast Guard, the National Transportation Safety Board, probably Meridian Shipping's insurance company. They'll want to know exactly what went wrong. And what will you tell them? I thought about it for a moment. The truth, that I identified a serious safety hazard a week before the explosion. That I warned the senior officers repeatedly. That the explosion could have been prevented if we'd taken 8 hours to replace some cables. Elena nodded. It's going to get messy. Isn't it? Probably. But 32 people are alive because you kept communications running and because everyone worked together when it mattered. She leaned against my shoulder. And I realized that despite everything we'd lost, the ship, our jobs, probably our future with Meridian Shipping, we'd gained something too. We'd proven to ourselves that when everything went to hell, we could keep our heads and do what needed to be done. The investigation took 3 months. The final report from the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the explosion aboard the Northern Horizon was caused by the failure of shipboard management to address known electrical hazards in a timely manner. Chief Rodriguez was cited for ignoring safety warnings, and Captain Morrison received a formal reprimand for failing to override her subordinates' poor judgment. Meridian Shipping settled out of court with the crew for undisclosed amounts. The company also agreed to implement new safety protocols requiring immediate repair of any electrical system rated as critical by certified marine electricians. Elena and I both found new jobs. She with a major shipping line operating out of Seattle, and me with a maritime electrical contractor specializing in ship retrofits and repairs. We see each other regularly now, and we've talked about the future. Sometimes I wake up at night, hearing the sound of arcing electricity and smelling burning insulation. But then I remember that everyone made it off that ship alive. In a business where disasters often end in tragedy, that's something to be proud of. The ocean doesn't care about your problems. And neither do most of the people running ships. But sometimes, if you're persistent and lucky and refuse to give up on doing the right thing, you can save lives, even if it's just by replacing some cables before they kill someone. That's a lesson I'll never forget. Whether I'm working on a ship or dry land, safety isn't negotiable. Schedules aren't more important than lives. And sometimes the person with the least authority in the room knows the most about what's really dangerous. The Northern Horizon rests in 12,000 feet of water, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. She's just another statistic now. Another entry in the maritime casualty reports. But for 32 people, she was the ship that taught us what we were really made of when everything went wrong. And that's a voyage I'll never regret taking, no matter how it ended.
That's a wrap on today's story. If this tale pulled you in like it did me, smash that like button and subscribe for more short stories every week. What should read next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep those pages turning.